Hello and welcome. Thank you all so much for joining me. It's incredibly lovely to see so many of you today. My name is Shafi Musaddiq and I'm the news editor at Alliance Magazine. Wherever you are in the world today, thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate your time. There is so much to discuss. We'll be touching today on key findings from the International Education Funders Group and asking whether philanthropy in Africa is reaching its full potential to support education for all. We'll also be exploring how can philanthropy effectively shape future investments in education and what can be done to address certain gaps. But before we hear from our panelists, a brief word about the format of this event. We'll run for an hour, and in the last 20 minutes or so, we'll have a question and answer session, which we will invite all of you to take part in. There are two ways you can get involved. Feel free to introduce yourself using the chat function. Just click on the speech bubble on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You can also use this chat to let us know if you're having any issues with your audio. Our team are on hand behind the scenes if you need any help. You can also ask a question to our panelists at any time. Use the Slido Q&A app. You can see that's on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll be keeping an eye on that throughout the webinar and selecting questions to put to the panelists during the Q&A. Time is obviously short and we'll put as many of them as possible to our panel. Should you also wish to do so, on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a CC button. That's for closed captioning. We really encourage you to use this if you need to. Lastly, if you'd like to receive Alliance Magazine, you can use the code EVENT24, that's in capital letters, to get 20% off all your subscription. We'll put that link in the chat if you'd like to subscribe. So, to our conversation, let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Laura Savage. She is the Executive Director of the International Education Funders Group, the largest global network of philanthropic foundations and donor advised funds focused on advancing SDG 4, otherwise known as the UN's education goals. Laura aims to harness the potential of philanthropy towards greater impact on education outcomes. Laura's previous background as an education aid funder includes work at UNICEF and the British Foreign Office. Laura has worked in many places around the world and she comes to us from Denmark today, where she lives. We also have Sarah Ruto. She's the program lead for foundational learning in Africa at Enchidna Giving. Her career in education and research spans over 30 years, including roles in teaching, academia, and as a founder in the not-for-profit sector, as well as government. Sarah is the chairperson of the Kisi University Council, a role that is rekindling a deeper interest in universities, evidence, and knowledge preservation. And finally, we have Gail Campbell. She's the CEO of the Xenex Foundation, an independent donor organisation that focuses on maths and language education in South Africa. With over 25 years of experience, Gail has ample expertise in the education sector. Gail's previous experience as a practitioner and lecturer in the field of social work has been influential in shaping her leadership practice and developmental focus. Gail also currently serves on several non-profit boards in education. Thank you all so much for joining. Laura, I'd like to turn to you first. The report outlines trends in educational philanthropy across Africa. Give us all a brief summary as to what was found and some of your conclusions.
Thanks, Shafi, and thank you everyone for joining. It's great to be here and it's great to put this report out into the world. It's the product of about 10 months of conversation between the IEFG and a lot of sister networks across the continent, the Africa Philanthropy Network, the Africa Venture Philanthropy Alliance, IPASA, the Network of Philanthropy in South Africa, the East Africa Philanthropy Network, the Center for Philanthropy in Africa, Trust Africa, and more. So this report was a collaboration because this year, 2024, is the year of education declared by the African Union. And the whole year has been both a celebration of all work to advance education outcomes across Africa, but also a push, a drive to achieve more from every actor across the education space. And at the start of the year, we all reflected within IEFG, there are 100 members, 60% of whom fund in Africa somewhere. We reflected that unless we were to make a significant part of that, to carve out something specific, philanthropy would not be recognized or discussed as part of that year of education. And we wanted to kind of achieve those two things, to feature philanthropy as part of the conversation and to showcase the range of ways that philanthropy is contributing to education, but also to challenge and to raise that question that Shafi, you raised earlier. Is philanthropy doing enough? Could philanthropy's potential be better realized? And that's really what over the pages of this report you'll see and find. The first big finding, and it will be familiar to anyone who works in or works with philanthropy, is that there isn't a huge amount of published data. There isn't a huge amount. It's not, a sector that is yet used to publishing a huge amount of data about itself. So there's really one major data set, the OECD data set on private philanthropy, and a lot of the quantitative analysis comes from this. And there we see that education is a major sector of funding in Africa. It's the second biggest sector. That the biggest funders of education in Africa within that data set are international funders, household names many of you will have heard of. That funding to education, while a major sector, goes primarily on some of the higher or TVET related post-secondary education with some scholarships and school construction, with a lesser proportion going to the K-12 education investments that a lot of governments are focusing on. And we see some trends in increased giving, for example, and we for sure see focused investment in a small number of countries, in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Kenya, for example, and then no giving, no data in an awful lot of the rest of the continent. So we see some from the quantitative data, but then you'll see in the report a range of qualitative data that builds on focus groups, consultations, and interviews that some of you will have been a part of, that then really turns to anecdotal and observational reflections on philanthropy and the role of philanthropy and where we can go next. And I think that's really what we're really keen to spark with this conversation today, because the bottom line is, the answer is no, right? The potential of philanthropy to advance education goals in Africa is not where anyone here wants it to be. We believe that philanthropy has huge potential. The levers of philanthropy are not yet fully being realized. It is a growth sector, both in terms of the institutional philanthropy that we talk about, but also the broader definitions that we don't touch on so much in the report, such as remittances and religious philanthropy and the rich and diverse forms of giving in and across the continent. So we see this as a conversation starter. We're keen to explore ways that we can help and support that conversation as a partnership of various networks to support that conversation over the coming years, and hope that the report sparks a whole bunch of different questions and reflections that we'd love to hear from.
Thanks, Laura. It certainly is a conversation starter. And bearing that in mind, Gail, I'd like to turn to you. Do you think philanthropy in Africa is being harnessed to its full potential for education for all? And if not, why not? Gail, you might be on mute.
Good afternoon, and Thanks for organizing the panel, to Alliance and to IEFG and the partners for putting the report together. So I got to the end of the report, Shafi, and I thought about, well, how can we do more? How can we do it more collaboratively? And how can we be more impactful? So there were 4 things I just want to touch on that struck me about the report. And I constantly had the question, as you said, how can we do more? And the one was the broad-based definition of philanthropy that went from individual, almost I found a definition that said all of us are philanthropists in our individual way, and to formal giving. And I'm going to talk about my experience in relation to formal giving and reflect a bit on South Africa. And what struck me was the thinking about domestic philanthropy and philanthropy from international sources in different countries, and certainly saw how that shapes the agenda in terms of what we do, what gets funded, and how philanthropy takes place in different countries. Interestingly, in South Africa, it's the direct opposite. Domestic philanthropy is much bigger than any kind of international money coming into the country. The second thing that I looked at the report is what I'm calling the enabling environment. The formal environment to encourage, to regulate, to create more accountability in philanthropy. And I asked myself a question: if you have a more regulated space, does this encourage giving? Does it create more accountability? Now, coming from South Africa, where we are in a very formal regulated space, the answer is no. And so thinking about that, we as working in the philanthropic sector have got to think really carefully about issues of power and accountability. The one thing, though, I must say that I've picked up in South Africa, and this relates to corporate giving, there is legislation that talks about license to operate and puts conditions for corporates to operate in the South African context, local corporates and international corporates coming into South Africa. And that has stimulated more money being made available for philanthropic causes and for education. I also reflected a lot on the discussion about localization, trust-based philanthropy, and then working with governments. And I just wanted to say, for me, when I read that, I don't want us to think about it as a binary position and as a value judgment, that if you're not working at grassroots level or with local organizations, that you're not doing good philanthropy. It's a continuum and it's fit for purpose. In South Africa, we have 100% access, 90% public schooling. Government has got a mandate, and perhaps that's why in South Africa you have more talk of how you work in education. And last, I wasn't surprised about the limited evidence about what we're doing and evidence about impact. And I really thought that's what we need to take away from this reporting going forward. If we want to do better work in philanthropy, we've got to be more evidence-based in the way we understand what we need to do, what we do, and how we contribute to the knowledge base of what works and what doesn't work. So those are just some comments from me in looking at the reports and thinking about what we can do more of in as philanthropy.
Thank you, Gail. I think many of our viewers may have questions or indeed statements to add with regards to regulation and where they are. Um, if you do have a question, please do drop it in the Q&A box. We will come to your questions at the end. Sarah, I'd like to turn to you. What will you do differently after reading this report, and what do you want your peers to do differently?
Thank you. I must first start by stating that I have been in so many conversations, but this must be the first conversation I'm in on this topic of philanthropy. And therefore, I will not have too many points to make, but maybe it shows that we do not talk enough about it. And perhaps it is the dearth of evidence that is there, but it would really be great if we had a lot more conversations, because when you converse in this very busy world, then it brings to the fore this topic, which is important. And I think that is what I would do differently. Let's have many more spaces to discuss the different forms. And I really love that this report has given us an expanded definition or description of philanthropy. It has recognized that giving is not only more important when it comes from various institutions or when it is big and comes from high net individuals, that there are other forms of giving that are as important, and that this giving is ingrained in our own cultures, in our own contexts. And it is important to recognize that. And that many of you give, it accumulates to more. And that is the concept, for example, of the Harambee spirit. And so I think the first thing that perhaps I would do differently after reading this report, and I must thank the report for bringing in these are the different forms of understanding philanthropy and giving, I would give agency back by recognizing that philanthropy is not Western, it is not foreign, it is an integral part of whom we are. It is perhaps what makes us human. And so that part of giving agency, I think, is so important, especially when you have grown up in a context where most of the discourse is a deficit discourse. It is about what you do not have. And so while it looks very simple, for me, it is very important that in giving back agency, you give back strength of power, of mentality, that actually there are so many ways in which you give, and it is important to give because that way you are able to contribute towards improving your own situation, your own self. Growth to be better doesn't necessarily come from out there. It is within us. But we spend too much time taking away and making people feel that they are not doing what they are supposed to do. So for me, that would be the first and perhaps the most important thing, the mental strength to know that in Africa, we have given before, we do give. Sometimes nobody brings it together to show how big this is. Because if you just think about the giving from the remittances, I've been told it is very huge. But who actually talks about it? And this is what I mean. I think it is by amplifying this that we will show that there is a lot. And all of it, big from the West, from internal, is what we need to improve ourselves. The second one, and Gail has talked a little bit about it, and I do not know of the various, 88 participants who are in this conversation, how many of them sit in our regulatory bodies in government? Because I think that there is a lot more that could be done, especially in African contexts, in thinking about the taxation policies, and that will allow one to give back more. Governments are important, but I think individuals are where you make quick decisions. And that is why leaving the giving at the individual level is very important. And I applaud those organizations that have within them certain policies that allow giving, where they say, if you give, I will give twice more, as an organization. So all these are ways in which we can amplify so that we're not looking at just the few usual suspects, be they organizations or individuals, but actually the millions of us who cumulatively can do a little bit more. So I think there is more in looking at ourselves, those of us here, and seeing the potential in ourselves to be this group that can add on what we already have. So we don't take away what we have, it's what adding on what we have. So what would I like to see my peers doing differently? I don't know who my peers would be. I work for Echidna Giving, which is an organization based in America, giving to organizations in Africa and Asia. And I think I appreciate what they do. Sometimes there has been a feel that it goes to only certain places and maybe it's dwindling, going to climate, running away from the areas that are important. I think it is important for my peers, even those, there are fewer from Kenya. I'd like to see more. But for those of us who are in this space, let us take this responsibility very seriously, that when you start on a course, stick to it to the end, or to whichever end you're able to see. It is sometimes disheartening when one gives and you allow a dream to start being, and then after 2 years, you change your organizational strategy or change course, and it leaves people in a worse place than they were in. So there is a responsibility that comes with giving, and I think it is a responsibility we need to take seriously, and it's a responsibility born out of a belief we want to contribute towards a good. So let us also take that responsibility seriously, and I hope to see many more from my own context, from various African countries. We see corporates having visibility. There are other forms that we need to give more visibility. I know there is a lot of giving, but it's in different forms that we are not able to capitalize on it. Let's see how it is so that we make it. It's easier. In Kenya, we say a shilling shines a shilling. So if one is able to see that this practice is already there, then it's easier to grow it. Back to you, Sha.
Thank you, Sarah. That's incredibly powerful. And I love the way you talk about giving. When we reframe philanthropy as giving, it becomes so much more vast, so much more fluid, and it goes beyond the frameworks of institutional philanthropy that has often been defined with Western philanthropy. I'm sure many people on this call will absolutely connect with what you're saying. So thank you so much. Laura, I just wanted to ask you, did you have a light bulb moment in terms of as the report was being produced? Was there any significant light bulb moment for you about some of the conclusions that you came to?
There were a few. I was surprised when we first started talking to people about education philanthropy that the first assumption was that education equals higher education, because a lot of the research that's been done on education philanthropy, and I think a lot of the first form of giving for those who choose to give to education goes into higher education, whether it's scholarships to university or it's university faculty funding. So that was the first spark that maybe we need to understand this sector better, because I think a lot of IEFG members, some fund higher education too, but a lot fund primary school, secondary school, alternative non-formal education. And where is the discussion about that? Where's the research on that form of philanthropy? And I think you're right, Sarah, that we don't tend to talk about philanthropy and its practice a lot. It's not a huge literature, a huge formal literature. And so the questions that we asked what, even some of the biggest trends, what are the trends within domestic philanthropy vis-a-vis international philanthropy to education? Can we see the extent to which giving is to international NGOs versus national NGOs or grassroots organizations? Can we see some of the trends, so that in part that was for our interest to draw out and spark a conversation within IEFG membership about some of the different questions that many of our members are asking. So I think the second light bulb moment for me was, we're not actually able to say a huge amount about it because there isn't a lot of data out there. And one of the things that I think as a group of networks now will do is to gather at the OECD Africa Philanthropy Day next month and work out, are there ways that we can join forces to make it easier to shine some of that data to the surface so that we can use it in order to point out gaps and to highlight opportunities. And I think the third light bulb moment was, and this is something I suppose has been percolating for a while, but the realization that outside of the philanthropy community, where partners of philanthropy and foundations themselves speak a lot about what philanthropy funds and the different levers philanthropy has. For example, connections through to businesses, through the corporate foundations, or indeed the boards of the family foundations, the advocacy voice, the general voice that some of these organizations can bring, because they're household names, whether domestic or international. I think the light bulb moment was, we need to also expand the conversation outside philanthropy. This is not just a conversation that philanthropy needs to have within the wider education sector. And that's where I've spent most of my career, not within philanthropy. Within the wider education sector, we need to have a bigger conversation about philanthropy being more than a checkbook, philanthropy being more than that extra piece of money that comes in to top up what some of the bilaterals, multilaterals, or government can't do. And that's, I think, something that we aim to achieve then through a series of conversations and partnerships over the years to come.
Yeah, speaking of partnerships, this is a question for Gail. Are you already collaborating with a range of other philanthropy? Can you tell us more about what has worked and what hasn't? Are there ways to expand out internationally as well as domestically?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, we as a foundation in South Africa, with the other foundations working in education, are beginning to work more collaboratively, and that's come from some energy amongst the different organizations, corporate and private philanthropy, and also because of the important work that networks have been doing to get us to talk more, because often collaboration starts, as Sarah would say, with just talking more and learning about each other, learning about what we do, and just learning from each other what's worked and what hasn't worked. And that's a very important part of just collaborating to talk. Where we're getting more traction now in South Africa is collaborating to pool resources to fund collaboratively. And that's new and very exciting, but very difficult and hard, because you're bringing together organizations and you're trying to merge mandates and strategies and ways of working. But it's exciting because it's more coordinated. We can have better leverage if we pool our resources. And of course, we can begin to talk to government and engage with NGOs as a coordinated group of organizations, because when we work individually, we also unintentionally create a lot of competition in the nonprofit space. And when we can talk together as a more in a more coordinated way, I think that helps. But certainly very excited that we're doing that kind of work in South Africa now. Hard, but I'm quite excited about where we can go in working more collaboratively.
Thanks, Gail. Yeah, there's a lot of incentives still, I think. And Sarah, this might be one for you. I'm wondering, what are the incentives and disincentives for philanthropy to share information about what you do? How can networks like those who supported this report support foundations to share information with each other as a first step and then beyond?
It almost feels criminal for one to ask for disincentives of sharing information. Because how can we do that when the issues and the problems we are facing are so big that we cannot get there alone, that we need to get there together? And so the one disincentive I feel that perhaps people might keep people from sharing information is when people want to go for personal glory. When you feel that by sharing information or working together, the you will get lost in the we. And we, of course, belong to very capitalist industries. We belong to spaces where you need to share your individualistic part in order to get a little bit and to get a little bit more. And so I think a little bit of Ubuntu could be good for us. That I am because we are. And as long as we have that, then we will find that the way, the default setting we will think about working is actually in working together, in sharing. What the IT space taught us in their crowdsourcing, because of sharing that, they were able to have much more progress than this protective approach that we have had. It is a challenge that we need to give to ourselves, that if we are true about social development, then we have no option than to share. Because the incentives for sharing, I think, is that we will accelerate growth. We will see growth stuff happening in such a fast way that it's going to shock us. We will have collective impact. And because each of us will be a winner and we see ourselves in the role that we have played, all of us will know that what we are doing is worthwhile. We will lift each other up. And I think we will be happier people. I like when I go to places and I see happiness curriculum, because surely the purpose of living must be to enjoy things. And the competitive nature of keeping to oneself, to me, is really a very historical way. I remember when I joined government to work, a colleague who's a career civil servant told me that if you do not care about personal attribution, that you're willing that an idea that may have come from you immediately becomes our idea, you will do a lot. But if you want every time for people to know it's you who did it, then you're not going to achieve more. So if we are really honest about wanting to accelerate development, we have no option but to share. And in that respect, then, I see that a place like a network like IEFG, I think offers three opportunities that I have seen, and I'm now talking as a person who has been active in IEFG since I joined last year. There are perhaps three opportunities that I see that have allowed one to grow, and why such a network is important. The first is at individual level, where it is a space where you're able to find each other, people who have been here longer, who have an experience they have not written. And at that individual level, one is able to connect, to learn, hopefully unlearn, there are certain things about philanthropic giving that we need to unlearn and to share and just grow as individuals. And that's why one reason why it is important. And I think more recently, I'm seeing there are even more formalized opportunities to grow. I belong to also another network in informal gathering, I'd call it. It's called the Kenya Women in Philanthropy. And I have seen this to be also a space that is a healing space, because sometimes when you're a woman and a young woman and you go to meet somebody, they're expecting maybe a white face to come. And so this affects your person. And so it's a space where people talk about the challenges unique to them that they go through. And if you don't come together, you'll suffer alone. But when you come together, you realize, this is what's happening and this is what we can do. So at the individual level. The other useful part I have seen is at the thematic level, where you connect in terms of the areas that you're doing your giving. And you work together, think together, and improve your practice. And then the last area which I see that is important, and where I would put a conversation like this, is to think a little bit more deeply about the field we are in. We are in this space of philanthropy. What is it that we can do together to grow it as a field? These are things that you cannot do alone. You need to be in a space that allows this collective thinking. Back to you.
Sarah, you spread joy into this room. I love it. I saw Laura nodding away there. And Gail too. Do either of you have any thoughts to add to what Sarah said about collectivity?
Yeah, when Sarah was talking and I was thinking back to the question you asked me about collaboration and how it works, and the one thing that you've got to understand in working in this space is that you've got to have low individual ego and low organizational ego, because that creates the opportunity to learn and grow. And certainly thinking about, and we've been involved in IPASA in South Africa and IEFG, and it's created a space for learning, but also a safe space. I think Sarah was talking about that similarly, to talk about what works and what doesn't work. So yes, we can talk about the hard evidence of what we've learned about impact. We can talk about how, grant craft and how we can do our work more effectively. But the importance of the space is developing trusting relationships, so we can talk about our difficulties and importantly what we're learning, what's worked and what hasn't worked.
Yeah, and Gail, to add to that, I think the data shows that philanthropic support to education is largely focused on infrastructure, scholarships, and higher education. Gail, to what extent do you think this matches the identified priorities of governments as well as children and parents?
Yeah. So firstly, governments have a very broad mandate, and I thought about why that could possibly be happening. And when you coming into philanthropy, and I'm reflecting on Zenix's own journey, and you're trying to find a space where you can start off. I want to say that infrastructure is tangible. You can see it. Scholarships is tangible. You can, you can, the individuals you saw supporting, and the kind of impact outcomes, is quite direct. The higher education space is very organized, so it's easier to get into. So I can understand why so much philanthropy is situated there. It's harder and messier You spoke about K1 to 12. It's harder and messier to work in the schooling space and also in the early childhood space that's taking place mainly at community-based levels. Because first of all, you need for your organization to have an infrastructure, a team that can, actually engage in that space, or your organization needs to partner with the local philanthropic organization to understand more about how to work in that space. So that was my take on when I read the report and why I saw the emphasis on higher education, on scholarships and infrastructure. And I think perhaps, and this is for IPASA and IEFG, we've got to put, I think, more, can I call it, knowledge learning pieces of what it takes to work in at school level, at local level, what it takes to work with government in the schooling space.
Yeah, Sarah, have experience at government level. How much of what Gail was saying connects to you?
I think there are some things that are easier to fund.
Yeah.
It's easier to give money for a scholarship. You can see the end result. Then, for example, supporting children who have increased self-awareness. How will you know that it's even happening? And so I think there are enough issues, and depending on where you are, one should be able, like if a child doesn't have clothes and food, children are human beings first before they are students. And so definitely any support to go to that area should go there. But the more, and that is why I talked about the field of philanthropy, the more we build ourselves and grow and develop a clearer understanding of how we can support, then I think we have an onus and a responsibility to go for the more difficult things that Gail was talking about. And this will mean, first and foremost, acknowledging that in education, there is a system of education, and it is the countries that have the core responsibility to give the education as a right. But because they're not quite doing it, we are coming in to complement or to demand accountability. There are various ways in which one can give. But if one is coming to complement, if you have developed yourself in the field, then I think you will have the ability to be able to also be sophisticated in your giving and to support the system to grow, not to harm it by doing parallel things. And so there is a spectrum of people and there is enough space. And I think it is our responsibility to always improve ourselves so that we are of use to the system in whichever space you have decided you will be most useful, whether it is complementing service delivery or checking accountability that the system is actually doing what it ought to do.
Thank you so much. I've just seen a flurry of questions come in. We have just over 15 minutes left, so I will get to the Q&A now. A reminder, if anybody does have questions, please put them in and I'll try to get to them in the next 15 minutes or so. I will start with a question from Nicholas. They have a question for Laura. They ask, how do you think academic research into philanthropic giving in the context of Africa can be beneficial for this sector? What should researchers focus their efforts on?
Thanks, Shafi, and thanks, Nicholas. It's an interesting question because I guess my knee-jerk reaction is, and my the questions I think most IEFG members are interested in are the research questions around education and philanthropy's contribution to it as part of that drive to achieve education outcomes, right? So I don't think the literature on philanthropy itself is particularly large. I think it is a small literature that is not particularly linked into this kind of massive literature that we might call international development, which includes a lot on the politics of aid. There's a lot of literature on donors, recipients, and so on. Philanthropic literature doesn't really link to that. But in itself, questions about philanthropy and deep research questions, I think are most interesting when they lead to questions of impact and questions of contribution. And for us, those questions of contribution are related to education. I think there are really, I mean, as this report shows, there are huge unanswered questions about the very, very basics, debates about the definition of philanthropy, huge questions about what it is that philanthropy funds. We don't have really agreed taxonomies of or definitions, categories to be able to really describe contributions to the education sector. So I think we're at the sort of very starting point, really, of understanding philanthropy's contribution. And I would want to be understanding that alongside, I mean, we're talking about institutional philanthropy here. I'd want to be understanding that alongside other forms of philanthropy. As Sarah said, we know somewhat about the scale of remittances, but not much more than that, really. We looked in this report to see whether religious philanthropy would come up. We know that it's huge. I mean, the 4 out of 5 schools within certain parts of West Africa are through religious giving. There's very little written down about it. So I think there's a huge set of questions. I'm very interested in one of our partners, AVPA, works a lot with business and social impact. I think there's more and more money coming to education. I think businesses are looking at education as an investable good. And that's something, that's a turn in a way away from some of the more traditional aid and development sector discourse in education. So I think there's a lot to be understood. I think that starts with better data. And I'm not sure, I mean, one of the things we did do as part of this report was to take a look across university faculties to see how, is there any just data sets out there? Are there any sort of hidden data sets that we could ask permission to use and so forth? They're difficult. Even if it's PhD research, they're difficult to access. I think the greater gift would be data that is open access and that we can all agree a sort of set of basic parameters that we, as a sort of sector of actors giving to education, that we would want to understand and track. And that's a question I think we do want to come together and debate coming out of this report are, what are, for example, the top 5 things that we would like to track next year, the year after, and track the evolution of philanthropy's giving and impact on the sector.
Thanks, Laura. Yeah, there's a lot to unpick, and there's questions coming in that are sort of semi-related to that. I'll take this one from Helen. Thank you, Helen, for this. She asks, do you have concerns about individual philanthropists or funds wanting to influence the educational agenda or school curricula? Your findings on partnership and capacity building implies wanting influence beyond supporting homegrown education. Gail or Sarah, either of you want to pick up on this? I'll go with Gail first.
Yeah, it's a very nuanced question, and certainly, and I want to talk about, first of all, when we talk about individual philanthropists, certainly, if I can just track a little bit of what's happening in South Africa, it's a lot of it is influenced by the philanthropist's understanding of what they see as important in education. But does it go as far as influencing the education agenda? I don't. I'm not sure it does. I think when you talk about philanthropy as a collective and influencing the agenda, I can say yes, there's very much potential for that to happen. And I'm just thinking of the drive currently in philanthropy to support foundational literacy and numeracy. Certainly, that's an influencing agenda. South Africa has a very defined curriculum, so you cannot influence school. We don't have a level where schools can create their own curricula. It's a very defined curricula in the way it's delivered. So yeah, that's the first part of the question, which I've tried to answer. Perhaps I didn't quite understand, Helen, unfortunately, the second part of your question. And that's, sorry, just for me, just looking at it as it stands. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a broad range question, and there's a similar question from Hadi. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. This one's for Sarah. They've said, Sarah, you spoke wonderfully about the need for collaboration in the philanthropic field. How do you get wealthy individual donors or corporations to buy into your idea of Ubuntu and not pursue their own philanthro-capitalistic goals? And are these donors necessary in order to achieve large-scale impact?
Can I buy myself a few seconds as I think about that question by responding to the previous one?
Yes, please.
Just
Yeah.
adding a thought. That there must be a reason why there is a saying that says the piper calls the tune. And I think it's good for us to acknowledge that when one gives funds to a money, funds come with power. And therefore, how does one ensure that the power is towards the good, towards building? And I think, therefore, it calls upon on the person giving to have a particular responsibility. And that is why I really love it when anybody who is giving is also influenced by a set of values, because then it will mean they are trying to look to support rather than infuse their own particular way of doing things. And having said that, when I used to teach history of education. When you have a system of education that is still developing, that is not yet strong, like Gale's South Africa, where the curriculums are still evolving, it is easier to influence those. And therefore, that is where one must really exercise, I think, being a good citizen and a good human being, not to put in their own specific agendas. And I think this then comes to the second question, which is a very difficult one. I wish I could get more high net individuals to give to education. I think I'm the program lead for foundational learning. I think if I would do that, I would have solved my problem. We'd no longer be talking about every child knowing how to read. We'd now move to the next level. So it is not easy, but I'm persuaded that it is possible when I see that there are a number of people who pledge. Like in America, there is the pledging thing, which I think really works very well. And there are a number of funds that have come up that are specifically tapping money from rich people who want to support a good, but do not necessarily want to think too deeply about the area. And so it comes back to perhaps we can do a little bit more better organizing to be able to tap. There is a lot of good in the world. And if we tapped a little bit more of it, but also encouraging the people to know that The fact that you have the money does not mean you have the power to think you can control the lives of people or systems of education. And so for me, the one thing then in terms that should govern giving is really respect. If you have respect, then you will ensure that you know the boundaries to go by.
Thank you. You never know, there may be some incredibly wealthy people on this call right now. If you are one of them, you know where to go. um, well, I have a question from Tom. Tom says, how can philanthropic efforts in Africa transition from traditional grant-based approaches to more catalytic or venture philanthropy models that empower local innovators and foster scalable, sustainable educational solutions? I'll open this up to any of the three of you.
Maybe Shafi, I'll jump in. Go on. No,
Okay.
Gail, go on. Go on.
A couple of thoughts, Shafi. The one is a commitment to work collaboratively, because certainly you can't do it on your own as a foundation. Secondly, a commitment to be driven by education. I sometimes think, in education, it becomes a bit like sports. When the rugby team or the soccer team's playing, I know more than the referee. And it's like we've all been to school, or our children, nephews, nieces have been to school. So we know what's best for the education system. So a commitment to be driven by evidence and understanding, education, and in your organization employing staff that can bring that expertise, or partnering with other organizations that can bring that expertise. The third, if you want to think about scale and systems change, you can't do that without working with government. Um, and that comes back, Siri, you spoke about complementing and strengthening what government does. And if you want to work at scale and look at how your work can be embedded and institutionalized, you have to look at how we can work with government at different levels in the education system. So those just three takeaways from me.
Laura, did you want to add to that?
Maybe just to say, and it builds really on what Gail said, but I think philanthropic efforts are already transitioning, and indeed maybe transition is the wrong word. I think one of the most exciting things about African philanthropy, linking to a question Claire put in the chat, there is such a range of forms of philanthropy in Africa. From my vantage point, I think a greater range than in other regional parts of the world, if we can break the world down that way. I think there is already a range from grant or even contract-based models of funding through to entirely unrestricted, through to catalytic venture philanthropy funding, everything from the big UN bureaucracy and in some cases government, all the way down to tiny grassroots organizations. And my reflection is that we shouldn't judge any form. There is no one right way to do philanthropy, but the spectrum is actually a really rich part of what philanthropy is and how we define it. So I think one of the things we tried to do in this report is not come to a static or sort of normative view on what good philanthropy looks like, but to keep an open mind and to watch and understand the evolving nature of all of these different forms. And I think one of the things that spaces like the networks that have put this report together can provide is both a space for understanding for those who work within one particular form of that philanthropy, to understand options and what others are doing, but also to then ask some of those self-challenging questions. Picking up on Helen's question earlier, these are spaces where we can reflect on what philanthropy is doing, why, and what impact it's having in all of its different forms.
Just a couple of minutes left. I will try and squeeze in one more quick question. This is from Gordana. and they've said this question goes to both Gail and Sarah. What networks such as IEFG and IPASA, IPASA do to create more moments such as this one right now? Should the networks evolve somehow to support funders better and reduce the danger of competition between funders Gail mentioned earlier? Sarah, I'll put this to you first.
Certainly, we don't need any duplication. We don't need any competition. And one can easily be able to address this by being driven by a set of values about how you will work together. And I have seen there are many more organizations that are setting out these values to guide how to work. And once you are united by a set of values, then you will find that you are able to collaborate. I have seen many funders today coming to collaborate to support an idea. I was once in a conversation where a young lady said she wished that there would be nothing in this world like a call for proposal. We should instead be calling for ideas. And once these ideas are there, you try to make them work. And so I think there is a different way in which we can work. And it would be great if spaces like IEFG not only just settled on the comfortable, which is bringing us together to learn, but also challenged us on how we can be better. And challenging means also pulling out some of the things that are not going on right, and having accountability start with us, I think will be the best way for us to also play our part in ensuring a better development or just having more progress.
Thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there. There are so many more questions that came in. I'm so sorry if I didn't get to your question. I will have to thank my panelists. Thank you so much to Laura, Gail, and Sarah for joining. We really, really appreciate it. I hope everybody has enjoyed today's discussion. If you found it helpful and engaging, don't forget to use the link in the chat to take advantage of the 20% discount to subscribe to Alliance using the code event24. Subscribing to Alliance ensures that you will always benefit from free access to all our events in future. Thank you all so much for joining, and we hope to see you soon at one of our future events. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks, Shad.